everyone, Dr. Klein here again, as you well know from now. Just wanted to stop in and say hi for a few minutes. I hope you guys are having a good week so far. Here we are, week 4 of the semester already. This is going really fast. It might not feel like it, but it really is. It's going pretty quickly. So this week I just wanted to take a few minutes and discuss some of the material that is related to this week's topic concerning federal court policymaking. So I think I tend to say this a lot. Maybe I'm just very excited about the course material. But this is another great week in my opinion. I always enjoy looking at the actions of the federal government and in particular the court system and how that has an influence in whether they're backing the federal government's measures or the measures that they're trying to take, or whether they're going to totally oppose and try and reverse the government's actions by making a law or a statute unconstitutional. So this was kind of a lighter week for you reading wise than other weeks have been, and other weeks that are going to still creep up on you guys. This week you only had 2 chapters from the Howard textbook, and then your next 2 SCOTUS cases, which focused on Brown v. Board of Education, which is a classic seminal case, and then the follow-up to it of Fisher v. the University of Texas at Austin, so our mother school in a sense. So these cases are actually very complementary, and if you've already read them at this point, you know why. But really these are 2 cases that in essence are discussing affirmative action at its start with Brown and then with its continued use through Fisher. And I really am I'm looking forward to the video presentations that your classmates have put together for this one. I think this is an excellent week to have a strong presentation for them, so I'm very excited to see those. Hopefully they're good. But this, because students are focusing on that aspect of the week, I'm going to take the time and really delve into the Howard and Segerwald text a little bit and start out talking about some of the environmental issues. And you might be saying, well, what does that really have to do with affirmative action? It doesn't have anything necessarily to do with with affirmative action as a policy, but really when we're talking about environmental policies from the federal government, it's sort of similar in a way in that it's taken sort of this generational and decades of continued use and prolonged sort of legislative impact before anything gets really done, and things have been shut down here and there and people have opposed it at every turn. So I guess sort of in that regard, a lot of environmental policies are similar in sort of the root of what the government is trying to accomplish comparative to affirmative action, but really 2 very diverse sort of outcomes that the government is looking for there. So sort of talking about environmental issues, our country has sort of always had a love-hate relationship with environmental issues, and I don't think anybody would make the argument that we need to destroy the environment completely and purposefully and totally, but there have been over the years sort of this necessary evil in destroying some of our natural resources and trying to make our country progress. And what I mean by that is, if you think about how we became an industrialized country, we have had a strong reliance on factory work, on mill work, on production, on the creation of supplies and the creation of products that have taken a toll on our environmental safety and on our environmental strength, if you will, right? So if you're going to build, you need resources like steel, and if you're going to build, you need a steel mill, right? So they're creating steel, they're building houses, building buildings, so you need wood. So that means the destruction and the cutting down trees, of destruction of forests to be able to do this. And you really sort of see in this country that you have this giant period of industrialization that we call the Industrial Revolution that takes place post-Civil War and really takes place all the way up and through the 1960s, 1970s, when we start to see this sort of almost rapid decline of industrialization here in the country, when we're starting to see the first large job exodus is taking place, where mills are going overseas and steel relocates and coal is dwindling because we're finding alternative power sources, and we're seeing the instead of building cars here in the US, we're seeing the importing tons of foreign vehicles that are not necessarily built in this country. So we're losing a lot of jobs, and industry is suffering as a result of it. But on the flip side, because we are not creating as much, cities like Pittsburgh, for the amount of steel mills they used to have in Pittsburgh, there was just a blanket of smog over the city almost entirely from the amount of pollution that was coming from the mills. And now that city and other cities that have been big industry producing cities have sort of cleaned up environmentally. So you sort of get the benefit of industry leaving in that regard, but then there's this bigger downfall of no jobs and less money and less revenue being produced here in this country. So sort of going to this 1970s platform again, as we're seeing this exodus of jobs take place, but we're also then seeing this other sort of increase or switch, if you want to call it that, at the governmental level, where there's this increased concern about environmental issues. So in December of 1970, the Richard Nixon administration essentially creates the Environmental Protection Agency, or as you know it today, the EPA. And the EPA was established basically by executive order in an attempt to oversee all sorts of environmental issues and to regulate things like pollution standards, right? Car emissions. So if you think about it now, some states, and California is an excellent example of this, if your car is too old and it's producing a certain level of emissions that are outside the boundaries of what the state allows, you then have to go get your car updated or buy a brand new car, because you're producing too many emissions, right? So you have to get that fixed. So that's something that the EPA would then oversee. So during the early 1970s, in the Howard and Seeger-Walt text, they actually go as far as to classify SCOTUS as being a very pro-environmental court at the time. And in the 1970s, this is sort of a very controversial thing to be, because during this time period, like I said, jobs are leaving, industry is leaving, and if you're going to be classified as pro-environmental, you're almost being seen as anti-industry at the time, and that was not something that you really wanted to be known as in the late 1960s, early 1970s. So some of the cases that came from this pro-environmentally friendly court really focused on things like the Union Electric Company case, which was a case that really just basically told the EPA that it's fine that you have standards, but you cannot overstep the bounds of your governmental policies by directly telling companies that they're in violation because they're not doing enough when your standards are here and you really want them to be here, right? And that's basically what the EPA was doing, where they had these very low standards for things like pollution or emission standards, and then they were trying to hold companies accountable because they weren't rising or overachieving those standards that they had set. So during the time, the Supreme Court also heard on things like mineral rights, the relocation of wildlife that was causing harm and destruction to local farms, and then of course things like pollution and air standards were the bigger cases that we saw during this time. So it was a rather very, I guess, active period, if you want to call it that, in which SCOTUS was hearing a lot of cases that focused on environmental safeguards. But then later there's sort of this switch that we see, and this is something we talked about last time, last week in lecture, that there's sort of these ebbs and flows, and the Supreme Court could decide one thing one session and then something totally different a couple years down the line. So during the early 1970s, you saw this more pro-environmentally friendly court, and then there's this switch that takes place in the 80s when there is an increase in jobs, and there's an increase in trying to, or this effort to get factories to come back to the United States, and SCOTUS then becomes decidedly less environmentally friendly. And these shifts sort of happen once you see new justices that come into their seats and the vacancies are being filled. Another theme that we sort of talked about last week. So in the 1970s, there's this period of environmental consciousness, and then we make a shift in the 80s and 90s, and now you almost see this swing that's coming back in the 2010 decade. I don't even know what you would call the 2010s, but 2010s. And sorry, I don't know the name of it. And you sort of now see this shift that's taking place once again, where we're moving towards this more environmentally friendly sort of consciousness that is occurring all over the United States at this point. So also this week, I wanted to just talk a little bit about I guess a little bit more about affirmative action as we're moving forward with the topic. And these two court cases that you're going to read and write about and then review in the videos this week are really going to re-emphasize the points that Howard and Segerwalt are talking about in their text. And I'm not going to spend time actually talking about the cases because you'll see those in the videos. But I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the actual text and affirmative action in regards to how they're discussing it. And so affirmative action at the start is sort of this very interesting concept because we are a country that keeps grappling with the idea of when it is appropriate to allow schools and universities to meet these quotas to sort of balance things out because they've been so unbalanced for so many years. And there is a large segment of the United States population that is so totally and full-heartedly against this idea of affirmative action. And then the flip side is a lot of people really like it and that it's doing sort of these great things for minorities and for women. But I think sort of this idea of balancing the scales, if you want to call it that, the original idea of affirmative action has sort of been distorted over the years in terms of public perception. And because it's now taking on such a negative connotation for parts of the country, the original idea of what affirmative action set out to do has now sort of been tainted in this negative light. Because really the idea of selecting a racial minority or a woman over a white male, considering the fact that they have the exact same qualifications, right? That in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. Workplaces, universities, a lot of places need diversity. Like if everybody just thought the exact same way, and if everybody just came from the same perspective, and I'm not by any means saying that all white men are exactly the same. Everybody has their own backgrounds and things that go into how they think and how they react. But I'm just saying, like, there are different cultural backgrounds that minorities experience than comparative to whites. And there are certain things that women will go through that men will never have any experiences with. So having that kind of racial and gender diversity in a workplace or in a university setting is sort of essential, because if everybody looked and acted and felt the same, nothing would ever get done. So you sort of need this influence or this sort of push of fresh blood, fresh ideas in a workplace or in a university setting. However, that doesn't mean that if the minority applicant or the female applicant is not by any means as qualified as the male applicant, that you should still choose the minority or the woman applicant simply because they are a racial or gender minority, right? The trick to affirmative action and similar to the Equal Opportunity Act is that everything has to be similar among the applicants, and that's one of the things that was called into question in the Fisher case, right? If the only thing that is different between the applicants is their race or their gender, right, then that is the true intention of affirmative action. It's not to meet the quotas by finding less qualified racial or gender minorities just to fill the quotas. It's finding the suitable qualified applicant who just happens to be a woman or just who happens to be a minority, racial minority person. So if the applicants are not evenly matched and somebody is chosen over the more qualified applicant because of their race or their gender, then this is a problem, right? This is the issue that's being highly contended or contested in this country right now. So with this week's case presentations, this is something that I'm hoping that the speakers are going to be talking about and pulling from the actual Supreme Court cases, because the Supreme Court has reviewed them on purpose for looking for these issues. And the last thing I sort of want to express to you guys, I have posted on Blackboard a secondary clip talking about school segregation and about how it is really not working the same way that we hoped it would as it sprung from the Brown case. And this video clip is from one of my favorite TV shows. If you haven't watched it, it's definitely worth a look. You can see a lot of episodes on YouTube. But the show is called Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, and it's on HBO. So, of course, that comes with all of the regular, warning signs. HBO show, you know what to expect. But the show is so good because Oliver sort of captures or takes on a lot of more controversial topics, things that people on regular TV don't want to touch. But in this segment, Oliver discusses the idea that really, despite the best efforts or the good, faithful intentions of people to actually eliminate school segregation in the country, that it sort of still exists at this very high level for 2016, 2017, and in some instances it's even gotten worse than it was during the Jim Crow era in the South, which is absolutely not what we intended to happen at all, but nevertheless segregation levels in some areas are still really high. So I just felt like this clip really fit in well with what we're trying to talk about in the mini lecture and with our 2 Supreme Court cases and with the Howard and Seeger-Walt text this week. So it just gives us a little bit different of an approach. And it's a little bit more fun too, right? It's not as dry as a textbook, and it's not nearly as dry as a Supreme Court case. So it gives us a little bit more of a lighthearted look on a very important and very sensitive subject. So again, remember, this is an HBO show, so all of the qualifiers go along with that, and that's just a disclaimer for you all. So I'm going to leave you here, and I'll let you watch the other video clips. You should have 3 for this week, plus the John Oliver clip, and I'll let you pick back up with those. And again, if you have any questions, comments about the weekly discussion boards or weekly writing assignments, please get in touch with me as soon as possible so I can help you out with those. Remember that there is a Wednesday deadline for part 1 of the discussion board and a Sunday night deadline for part 2 of the discussion boards. Make sure that you hit both by the due date, or it will be considered a late submission. So if there are no problems, no issues, no questions, I will meet you back in week 5 for the next mini lecture, and I hope you guys have a great week. I'll see you later. Bye.